Welcome to everybody this evening. It's really good to have you here. Thank you for coming. We're looking forward to Julie and her presentation, Trauma, Its Effect on Teens and Young Adults. Just want to thank you for coming. I'd like to open up with a scripture here from James. James 1:22, it says, "But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man absorbing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father in this, to visit the orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world." So looking at this here and coming here to tonight, it's just exciting what Julie has studied here these years in college and has put together this capstone. Julie is currently employed both as a teacher's aide and an intern with the social support department here at Ephrata Mennonite School. She is also a senior at Sattler College, and the seniors, when they put together their capstone, they put about 540 hours of work into it. So you're privileged tonight to hear in 3/4 of an hour to an hour what she has done, a lot of reading and research and interviewing, and she'll be able to tell us more about that. So her project is what's up here. And she has chosen it to study and see how trauma affects teenagers and young adults in our Anabaptist community, and how we can care for those who have survived trauma. So it's hopefully our takeaway, we can glean from this and be able to take away and have a better effect on our communities. So tonight, after the presentation, there'll be questions. She'll take questions and try to answer. And then also after that will be refreshments and be able to fellowship and enjoy time together. So in opening, I'd like to have a prayer at this time for Julie, and then turn it over to her. So shall we pray? Father, thank you so much for opportunity to be together here tonight. We thank you for Julie and her dedication and desire to follow you and to serve you in your kingdom here on earth. Be with her tonight. I pray for a peace that she would have, and a calmness and a clarity in her presentation, that she can share what she has learned and share with each one of us what we can learn from this here as we go forth in our ministry and with those around us. Just be with each one here, be with our hearts and our ears as we listen and hear, and be with Julie at this time. Pray us in your name. Amen.
Thank you. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming. Like he said, my name is Julie, and I'm a senior at Sattler College. And as a senior, I get the opportunity to do a capstone project. Each senior gets to do a capstone project that's unique to them, based on their major, their passions, their life experience, and the direction that God has for them. So I chose to research trauma and its effects on teens and young adults. I split my hours researching. I did 270 hours of research through reading books, reading articles, attending a seminar, conducting interviews, and completing a survey. And then I completed a 270-hour internship here at Ephrata Mennonite, researching how to improve trauma-informed care here in the classroom. So my vision for tonight is to see the Anabaptist community begin to discuss and change how we've interacted with those who've experienced trauma in the past. The order of presentation tonight will be as follows. First, I will discuss what is trauma. and then go through the physical, mental, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual effects of trauma. And then I'm going to discuss a little bit about why we should care and kind of talk about the presence of trauma within our own communities. And then what does healing look like? And what is the church's role within healing from trauma? And then we will close with a time of questions where you guys get to ask me questions, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. So to guide the evening, I would like to read a verse that has guided my research for the past 9 months, and it's Proverbs 31, 8-9, and it says, "Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy." So this verse was a guidance for King Lemuel in how he interacted with those within his kingdom. And I believe that this can be a verse that can guide us within the Anabaptist community and how we interact with those who've experienced trauma and deep pain within our own communities. So what is trauma? Trauma comes from an ancient Greek word, trauma, which means wound or damage. In short terms, trauma is either a primary or secondary exposure to an event which causes some kind of wound, whether it's mental, emotional, spiritual, or physical, within the individual exposed to the event. Some of the types of trauma are as follows. We have death or suicide of a family member, friend, or colleague, a serious death at the workplace, a serious workplace or line of duty injury, a disaster or multi-casualty incident, a police shooting, accidental killing or wounding of an innocent person, events with extreme threat to participants, significant events involving harm or potential harm to children, significant prolonged experiences of suffering, especially involving a loss, events in which victims are relatives, events with excessive media interest, and finally, any other significant event capable of causing considerable emotional distress to anyone exposed to it. So the characteristics above present kind of an example of what trauma is. Sadly, the topic of trauma does not end there. To further understand what trauma is and how to better heal from it, we have to understand the effects of trauma as well. So we're going to go into the physical effects of trauma first. I split this into 2 different parts. First, we're going to talk about neurobiology, and then, which is the biology of your brain, and then go into kind of the more biological effects, because the neurobiology affects how your body reacts physically. So there are 3 different levels that your brain will react to when you are exposed to a threat. The first level is social. This is the normal. What you see here is the normal program or stress response within our brain. There's 3 different levels. You see a threat, you may go up to the 3rd level, and then once the threat is neutralized, you'll descend down to the level 1 where you are at the beginning. So level 1 is social engagement or neuroception of safety. When you are in this level and you see a threat, some of your responses you may call out for help or support or comfort from those around you. If the threat is not neutralized in that first level, you'll move on to the next level when you see the threat. And the next level is fight or flight, or neuroception of danger. When this is activated, the person may fight off their threat or flee their threat. So this is where, if you're in school, this is where procrastination kicks in. And if the threat is not neutralized within the 2nd level, you'll move into the 3rd level. And the 3rd level is freeze or collapse. And this is neuroception of threat. In this level, the person's body will protect itself from the perceived danger because the threat has not been neutralized in the 2 other levels. They will protect themselves by freezing or shutting down. So basically, the brain will send a message to the rest of your body that you need to protect as much energy as you possibly can, so other systems will begin to shut down. Now, if you are in a normal program stress response, once the threat is neutralized, you'll go back to level 1. You'll kind of go back to homeostasis. However, if you have perceived danger or threats that are continuous or multiple different threats at the same time, your stress response can break. And this is called the disruption of feedback inhibition. And basically, that's the scientific way of saying that your body's stress thermostat is broken. So instead of going up in the 3 different levels and then coming back down, you'll stay in the level that you've gone to. So if you're in level 2, when the threat is neutralized, if your stress response is broken, you won't go down to level 1, you'll stay in level 2. And this will happen, and you won't leave level 2 until you feel like you are safe. And because you can stay in these levels, you'll have different effects on your actual physical being. So some of those effects, the side effects of staying in that stress response are as follows. You can have comorbidity, which is the presence of 2 or more distinct illnesses at the same time. So this can be diabetes, this can be heart disease, this can be Lyme's disease, and you can have them all at the same time. The next one is somatic symptoms. And these are basically the way your body's muscles handle the stress. So you can have migraines, you can have jaw pain, or you can have muscle tension. And these are kind of side effects of maintaining that stress response and being tense all the time. And then the last one is a really long list, and I'm not going to read it for you because that takes a lot of time. So all of these effects can happen when you are stuck in those levels of stress response. And you may think, why is this possible? But when your brain is in survivor mode, your other systems will shut down. So your immune system, your digestive system, and all of those systems will try to protect yourself by exuding as little energy as possible. So these kinds of disorders will begin to develop because your system's not working properly. Sadly, physical effects are not the only effects that trauma has. And so we're going to go into mental effects now. Mental effects I could talk about for a very, very long time, but I won't because we only have 45 minutes. So I'm going to talk about something that I think is very important for the Anabaptist community to think about and learn about, and that is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. This is like post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, except that CPTSD forms when there is a presence of chronic or repeated trauma over time. So, for example, child abuse of any kind, or different kinds of trauma layered on top of each other. So if you're a child and your uncle dies, and then a month later your grandma dies, and then a month later another uncle dies, and then there's a car accident with your family involved, this kind of post-traumatic stress response will be complex, but it will still develop. And some of the ways to recognize this within an individual is they will have difficulties with affect regulation, and basically this means that there will be a presence of persistent anger or self-injurious behaviors. And you may be wondering, what does that mean? So self-injurious behaviors are any kind of self-harm, so cutting, alcohol abuse, substance abuse, pornography, teen pregnancy can be a side effect of this. Any of those kinds of self-destructive behaviors that present themselves within an individual can be a part of them not being able to regulate themselves. The next one is dissociation, and this is a mental and emotional way of removing oneself from a hurtful or dangerous present. You can dissociate in multiple ways. You can dissociate from the physical sensations of your body, where you don't actually feel the pain that's happening to you physically. You can dissociate from your emotions, so you shut down your emotions and you have no feelings. You can dissociate from the reality to the point where you don't know what's happening around you. And you may actually know what this is. So if you've ever been driving a car down the road and all of a sudden you remember you're driving a car down the road, that's kind of disconnecting from reality and coming back in. So that's kind of what happens when you're dissociating. And then another way is through self-perception. Oftentimes there will be a presence of deep shame or self-hatred within the survivor. And then the next one we see often in survivors of child abuse, and that's the perception of the perpetrator is changed. So a survivor of child abuse will take the things that the abuser has said and internalize them into beliefs about themselves. So what they see as truth about themselves is often the voice of the abuser. And that's how we see that play out. And then they will have difficulty with relationships as well. They'll just struggle to trust people around them because the world is not safe to them. We talked about the physical problems already and how the stress of trauma can display itself through the body. And then finally, we have systems of meaning, which is basically your worldview. So specifically within survivors of child abuse, you will see a kind of hopelessness surrounding healing and becoming whole, specifically in child abuse, because child abuse survivors have never felt whole because they've had so much pain as a child, and so they don't see how they could be whole again, and that's very difficult to kind of see that light at the end of the tunnel. So the mental ramifications of trauma that we see here you sometimes can only see the behaviors, and so it's really easy to kind of write someone off because of behaviors. But in reality, the behaviors are a side effect of what something deeper that's going on inside. So it's kind of the tip of the iceberg of the human being. To gain more of an understanding of the effects of trauma, we're going to move into emotional effects of trauma. And I could also talk about this for a very long time, but we're only here for a short amount of time. So I'm going to talk about something that I think is really important for the Anabaptist community to understand, and that's attachment patterns. And attachment patterns, or attachment theory, is the theory of how a person's relationship with their primary caregiver, their parent, as a child affects their relationships when they're older. So the patterns will fall on a spectrum, and as you can see, the first arrow is low avoidance to high avoidance, and then low anxiety to high anxiety. So there'll be 4 different attachment patterns, and they'll fall on each of the 4 quadrants. The first one is secure attachment, and this develops when a child has reliable and competent caregivers. So the caregiver was responsive to the child's needs, and they provided a secure base for the child to rely on as they're exploring the world. So they can go out, but they have someone that they can come back to and be reliant upon. This will develop adults and young adults who are comfortable with intimacy and depending on other people within relationships. The next one is anxious attachment. And this develops when a child has inconsistent or self-centered caregivers. The caregiver will tend to ignore the needs of the child or will be inconsistent in the attention that they're paying to their child. So one minute they could be a doting parent, and the next they want nothing to do with them. And this will raise people who are uneasy, vigilant, and worried about threats within relationships. The next attachment pattern is avoidant attachment. And this forms when a child has a caregiver who is dismissive of their needs. This doesn't concern me, fend for yourself, that type of parenting. The caregiver dismisses the needs of the child and sends the message, your needs are not important and it's not that bad, you're overreacting, and leaves the child to fend for themselves in regards to more of the basic needs like making meals and those kinds of things. This will raise a young individual who is very self-reliant and disinterested in intimacy in relationships. Basically, they do not trust people to take their needs seriously, so they'll do it themselves. And then finally, we have the 4th attachment pattern, and that is disorganized attachment. And this will form when a child has unpredictable, unsafe, or inconsistent caregivers. This can develop when a child experiences abuse, trauma, or chaos in the home. As a result, they learn to fear their caregivers and have no secure base, like I talked about in secure attachment, to turn to. So, as a result, it will raise individuals who are intentionally self-destructive in relationships. An individual who has disorganized attachment will try to do anything possible to show you that you do not actually love them. Sadly, these effects are not the only effects that trauma has. These are often seen, the behaviors that people with insecure attachment, so anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, or disorganized attachment, the behaviors that they exude are often seen as the problem instead of seeing the underlying issue. So to gain more of an understanding, we're going to move into spiritual effects of trauma. And spiritual effects of trauma affect an individual in 2 different ways. The first is their beliefs about God. So traumatic events in themselves are incidents that shake a person's worldview and force them to think beyond what they initially thought about the world. So obviously, because of that, their beliefs about God and the previous beliefs that they held about God's goodness and his sovereignty will be shaken, and they'll be forced to rethink how they viewed God. The next one is image of God. Within cases of child abuse particularly, the view of God can be skewed by the actions of the abuser. So if an abuser is a parent, they will view God the way they view their parent. They will view him as unsafe, untrustworthy, and unpredictable. I believe that the church's task within this is to show evidence of God's goodness to trauma survivors. So in the past, and I've seen in the present as well, church leaders can often write off the doubts that young people have about God and say, you're just not faithful enough. And I believe that that's wrong, because we need to be bringing them to God and his goodness and his reconciliation. So if they have doubts, I believe that our task is to continue to walk beside them faithfully, love them like Jesus loves them, which is unconditionally, and empower them to bring their questions about God to God himself. There is something that's really powerful when an individual brings their doubts about God to God and says, why are you like this? What have you done? And God says, I was here the whole time, and I'm right beside you. Like, there's something so powerful about that. So, because I've seen the church kind of fail, if I'm allowed to say that, I've seen the church kind of fail in the past in treating trauma survivors, and so I want to switch now and move into why we should care and what we should do. So I gave you a lot of information, so I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to breathe, because I also need to breathe and need a drink of water. So you're allowed to do that right now. Okay, we're back. Why should we care about trauma? You may be thinking right now, well, this is kind of the world's problems. I don't understand why this is something that a church and a community that is safe and structured should care. However, the sad reality is that we live in a fallen and broken world. That means that the problems that are of the world can be the problems in our community as well. So these are statistics that I found within my research in regards to the United States. So this is all 50 states as a whole. 6 out of 10 men and 5 out of 10 women experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. 1 in 5 Americans are sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused by the age of 18. 1 in 4 children were physically beaten by their parents to the point of marks, bruises, welts left over. 1 in 4 children grow up with alcoholic relatives. 1 in 8 children witness the beating of their mom. And the average onset age for abuse is ages 6 to 12. 1 to 5 female high school students experience physical or sexual abuse at the hands of their dating partner. And then finally, 20 million out of 120 million women within the U.S. have experienced a rape at some point in their life. That is 1 out of 6. You may be wondering, well, this is also statistics about the U.S., so this includes cities, and they're not really great places, and they're kind of terrible and dark. I decided to do a survey within our Anabaptist community. It was a 10-question survey. It was fairly simple, fairly quick, about the different types of trauma. And this reached a lot of people within Pennsylvania and Anabaptist communities within Pennsylvania, but then also some Anabaptist communities in the surrounding areas. I had 373 responses. These are some of the questions. So approximately 1 out of 2 people have experienced the death, injury, health issue of a loved one or in the workplace, school, or church. So that's about 203 responses, or 54%. 126 experienced an injury that disrupted their daily life and or caused them serious emotional distress. So that's about 1 out of 3. About 1 out of 4 experienced a natural disaster or multi-casualty incident. Approximately 1 out of 3 experienced a prolonged period of suffering. So that's 143 responses and about 38% of the surveys. 1 out of 3 people within our Anabaptist community have experienced some kind of abuse, whether it's emotional, whether it's mental, whether it's physical, whether it's sexual, whether it's spiritual. And 1 out of 8 experienced a threat to their human security. And human security is a broad term for freedom from fear, freedom from need, freedom from want, for the basic necessities of human life, to have a solid quality of life. And then I did something really interesting and asked if people had the presence of 2 or more mental illnesses in their life. And 180 of the responses said yes. And then 122 responses said they received some kind of support from a counselor, family member, or church. What was really sad about the survey was that when I asked question number 10 about the support from a counselor, family member, church member, whatever, very few people said that the church was helpful. Oftentimes they said that the church did more harm than good. And so how do we fix that? How do we change our actions to increase our effectiveness within healing? We have to first understand what healing looks like. So there are 3 steps within healing from trauma. The first one is safety and stabilization. And this is focused on physical safety, building trust, learning how to self-soothe, so developing those habits that are healthy to cope with your emotions, developing a support network as well. So safety and stabilization are important because they provide this foundation needed to walk through the healing and processing of the traumatic memory. Some of the key components of safety and stabilization are as follows: interventions if needed, residential treatment if needed, a safe home, so providing that safe place where the person can go so they feel safe and secure so they can begin to process, and helping the survivor understand and manage triggers. So starting to see what are those moments and places where your stress response gets worse, or where your body says, I'm in danger, I'm gonna leave. And then finally, developing a support network around the survivor. One of the things that I've seen throughout my research and my interviews is that healing relationship is something that is so essential to healing from trauma. So this is kind of developing that support network will help with those healing relationships. The next step is processing trauma memories. And this happens in 2 different ways. So the first way is telling the story of the trauma. So trauma in itself is very isolating and silencing. So having that safe relationship where people can actually sit and tell the story of what happened to them is very healing. And then having the space to lament and grieve the trauma. You cannot heal without grief. And so having this safe relationship and being able to process and actually grieve and sit through those feelings of loss. Because trauma in itself presents a loss. And so trauma survivors have to go through the grief of loss before they can get into the healing and the growth period. The final step, so the first 2 steps need to happen before we get to the final step. Final step is connection and growth. And this is where you work on your marriage, your parenting, your intimacy with others, your major life decisions. This is where you fine-tune conflict resolution skills, where you develop further clarity about safe boundaries, where you increase their self-regulatory skills. So this is the soothing, the self-soothing that's healthy. And then where you learn how to maintain healthy relationships within their bodies. So something that I've seen the Anabaptist Church continuously push is to move into step 3 before fully completing steps 1 and 2. And this is impossible. This will create individuals who are bitter and angry at the church, and they'll leave. And so what I propose tonight is that we begin to follow this pattern of safety and stabilization first, and then moving into processing and grieving the trauma, and then moving into working on those relationships that were broken. So what is the church's role? I have another guiding verse because I really like guiding verses, and it's Psalms 22:24. And it says, "For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help." As I have talked about, a major component of what has turned survivors away from the Anabaptist community is that they have not listened, and they have not grieved with them. They have condemned the behaviors instead of finding the issue underneath. So how do we do that? How do we have compassion for the brokenness inside of someone? We sit with them. We listen to them. We mourn with them. And then, when God leads, we walk with them into healing. So what is the church's role? Because I love when there's like practical steps that you can follow, because I'm a practical person. I have some practical steps for you. So the first one is to write notes of encouragement. Notes require no immediate response. They don't really have any strings attached. And they can be read and again as encouragement. This doesn't have to have words of your own. This can be Bible verses. This can be song lyrics. This can be anything that person would find encouraging. Do not wait for someone who is suffering to call you. Oftentimes, like I've said before, trauma isolates and silences. And so when you see someone who is suffering, reach out to them. Ask them how they're doing. Yeah, they may not say, I'm doing great, I'm doing fine, like, we don't need to worry about me. But, like, have the time to sit and listen and say, hey, I'm here for you, and I can listen. Include the survivor in fun things. This provides a way that they can build relationships safely in a manner that is fun. And granted, sometimes it is distracting from what's going on inside, but that can be helpful because that provides a breath of relief or a breath of fresh air within the struggle that they're walking through. Intercede faithfully. I cannot tell you how important prayer is in these situations. Prayer is something that is so powerful and so impactful because trauma survivors are in a war. And so prayer surrounds them with God's armies instead of Satan's armies. Know that you do not have all the answers. I'm up here tonight, and I don't even have all the answers. So know that even though you don't have all the answers, your presence in the midst of that suffering is still a gift to that person. Take care of yourself. You can't be effective if you burn out. So find your limits, find your boundaries, and hold to them to protect yourself from burnout. And then finally, seek Christ, who is the only source of life. Nurture your relationship with him continuously. He is the only one who has confronted evil in the past and has fully been victorious. And so when we rely on him, we have a power that is greater than no other. The power that is, yeah. So what is the church's role in healing from abuse? I want to talk about this a little bit because I've seen the church fail many times in abuse survivors. Relationships with Christ, relationships with their friends, relationships with the church, and I would like to see that changed. So these are some things that you can do that are practical. First, you can provide safety in the physical sense, so a place to live, the physical needs of the body. Oftentimes, trauma survivors, abuse survivors, will need that safe place to be able to get out of the survivor mode that they've been living in for years. And so this is a very tangible and practical way that the community as a whole can support the survivor. The next one is to give emotional support through a confidential care team from the community. I cannot stress the importance enough about confidentiality in these situations. It is a very painful situation, and when there is not confidentiality, it can cause a lot more pain. And so having that care team around them, whether it's 4 people, whether it's 5 people, whether it's 3 people, having that support will help them gain the strength that they need and empower them to the healing that they need. The next is to empower them to build structure throughout their daily life to alleviate some of the chaos. So abuse survivors live in a life that is very chaotic because their life is surrounded by an unpredictable person that is unsafe. So to combat that, by building in structure, by having an exact time you wake up every day, an exact time you eat breakfast, an exact time you eat lunch, those kinds of things will provide the structure that they need to feel safe, to get out of survivor mode and move into this state of being where they can actually begin to heal. The next one is prayer. Once again, cannot stress how important prayer is in these situations. And then financial support. Specifically in cases of domestic violence, finances can be used as a way to isolate and manipulate the survivor to stay with the abuser. So having that access to finances that is not the abuser is a great way to empower the individual to move out of that situation that is harmful to them. And implement an advocate of the same gender, could be their mentor, to intercede with ministry leaders. And I'm specifically thinking of females in this sense because ministry leaders, if their abuser is male, will be very scary and they're unsafe and they're unpredictable because they're viewing them in the eyes of the abuser, like I talked about before. And so having an advocate who is of the same gender is someone that's safe that they can talk to, who is confidential once again, but then can go to the ministry leaders and say, hey, this isn't working. Can we try something else? Hey, I really actually do need that rent money. Or hey, this support is really helpful. Please don't stop. Those kinds of things. So to close out, I want to read this quote that I found really impactful as I researched. And it's from Brad Hambrick in his handbook, Becoming a Church That Cares Well for the Abused. And I highly recommend this book. You all should have it on your bookcase. And this quote is, "We are called by God to care for those who are afflicted and needy, to tend to broken hearts and release the captives. Such Christ-like work not only brings hope and healing to the abused, our loving obedience to God in this arena is also transformative in our lives because we become more like Christ." As I was interviewing the people who have worked with trauma survivors, every single one of them talked about how transformative being in a relationship with a trauma survivor can be. Not only are you helping the trauma survivor, but the trauma survivor is teaching you things. And so this kind of relationship where we write off people because of the behaviors is not Christ-like. It's not showing God's love, and it needs to change. And so when we build these relationships and we move in and love them like Jesus loved them, we can show them incredible things, and they can be reconciled to God. So, that's all I had for you. We will move into a time of questions now, so the ushers can stand up wherever you are, and you guys can have your questions and answer them, and I will try to answer them as much as possible.
I'm curious if you have thoughts on why it is that people who have experienced trauma, their experiences are often delegitimized and not taken seriously. Like, what is it about people that makes them naturally not take those things seriously?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I'm still kind of solidifying what my thoughts are on that, but I think it kind of boils down to a couple of things. One of it can be pride. It is hard to stand there and say, I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry that we trusted that individual, and I'm sorry that person was either on the ministry team or was welcome in our church. It's very hard for people to say that. And then also it can be fear of the unknown. Oftentimes, fear of the unknown can be very debilitating to people. And so when they're scared of what may happen if we try and figure out what is going on with this individual, they can be very, paralyzed by their fear. And then I think just not knowing what can happen by invalidating people's experiences, that's very painful. And so I think that people who are like, well, I don't understand what you're saying, and I don't think that can actually happen, so you must be wrong, that is very invalidating. And I think that's kind of just, once again, it can be linked to pride or fear of the unknown, that you just don't understand what's going on, kind of thing.
In your research, did you stumble across some churches that are really doing it well? And in that case, can you unpack how did they practically develop something that really is effective?
I haven't, really. I think that people have done parts of the whole well. I think it's really easy for the Anabaptist community to support the physical needs. So if a barn burns down, we know that a barn raising is happening the next weekend, those kinds of things. But I think it's more difficult to support the whole part of the individual. if that makes sense. So, no, I haven't.
I also think trauma is a new study. It's kind of new research, and we're discovering so much about it, so we have a lot to learn. And that was kind of brings me to my question. I've heard a lot about PTSD, but you brought up something called CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which I really have not heard much about. I think that might be a new thing that's being studied, and it sounds like it's more it's complex and it's chronic. And you gave an example of how it's like someone experiences a grandfather dying and then another death and then an accident, so one on top of another. And you went through those so quickly, I wasn't able to get all of them, but the first one was about self-injurious behaviors and self-destructive behaviors, and I think you might have started talking about addictions, maybe. And so if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about that, and also when it comes to addictions, those are so complicated and complex. So do you treat that addiction, or do you treat the trauma, or is it both?
So the addictions are a very complex issue. Part of substance abuse is that it produces dopamine. The different addictive substances that people will take produce dopamine, and dopamine is a hormone within your brain that counteracts the stress hormones that you will release. So like I said in that chart, that during those levels, so the level 2 and level 3, adrenaline and cortisol are being released within your body because it's a stressful situation. And so you have a lot of adrenaline, and you're trying to figure out, how am I going to get away from this threat? That's where the substance comes in and produces this dopamine that calms you down. And so very quickly, people will find alcohol is a little bit different because it's more of a depressive, so it kind of just mutes everything that's going on. But any kind of drug or pornography, food, those kinds of things produce dopamine within a person, and that will counteract the stress hormones to produce this kind of state of calmness or equilibrium, which is not actually equilibrium. It's false. It's fake. But they'll feel that in their brain and realize that, oh, this actually makes me feel a little bit better, so I'm going to do it again and again and again and again, and that's when they get trapped in that addiction. So to treat that, you can take it multiple ways. There are some people that just take it as it's a biological factor within your brain, and so they treat the actions and the biology and kind of the more science side of it. And then there are some people that are like, no, this is spiritual, so we're only going to treat the spiritual side and only going to treat what's happening within your spirit and how this is a sin issue. But I think that it can be both. I think that it can be both sin and biology. And so I think that to treat it, you also have to go through both. So you have to reach kind of the biology and say, okay, so what are ways that we can produce dopamine within your system that are healthy? But then also, what are ways that we can talk about what's happened to you that's caused you to want this dopamine, or how can we heal the choices that you've made? Does that answer your question? Okay.
Does trauma affect or alter the brain's either molecular or neural composition? Like, have you come across anything in your studies about how trauma can affect the brain physically and alter the way people can think?
Yes, it does. That's the short answer. It it affects through hormones. It can affect through how fast your neurons fire as well. But then there's also the component where our brains there's neuroplasticity, which just basically means that your brain can change. So through these experiences, our brain is shaped by that because of your hormones releasing certain ways, your neurons changing how they fire, those kinds of things. And then to go into treatment, that is also a component that we have to discuss and work with as well. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? All right, to close out the evening completely, I want to change gears a little bit. How I talked about, you guys remember the word from the Greek origins that I was explaining at the very, very beginning about the definition of trauma? So it's trauma, and that word is ancient Greek, which is part of the Greek language that was used to write the Greek New Testament and the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. And something that's super fascinating to me, I took 2 years of Greek, so this is so cool. The word that's used within the Isaiah 53 prophecy about the suffering servant, where it says, he was wounded for our transgressions, that word that's used for wounded there is the verbal form of trauma. So, when we take that into consideration, Christ has felt trauma. Christ has been wounded. And so, if you are someone who resonates with deep trauma and deep pain, Jesus has felt those wounds. He has felt those scars. And he wants you to know that you're not alone in your suffering because he's felt it. And he's welcoming you with open arms to be healed, to be whole, and to be safe from the brokenness that you feel. You need only come. Thank you for coming. The refreshments are in the back. If you would like to see some of the resources that I used, they are on the side window by the sound guy. Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, maybe I could drop down. I appreciate your interest in the Anabaptist community and the church to do better. The thought is going through my mind that this is the Anabaptist community, for the most part, as a non-professional clergy
Mm-hmm.
and a non-professional leadership team.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the question I have is, I'm struggling to know, because this is so complex, and it is,
Mm-hmm.
and really requires significant training
Mm-hmm.
to care well
Mm-hmm.
for these people. And so I'm wondering, how does that come together
Mm-hmm.
with an untrained, are you hearing me?
Yeah, yeah.
So I was wondering if you gave some thought to that. What should a little country church
Mm.
that has 65 people on a Sunday morning and bless their hearts, the minister is a plumber?
Yeah, yeah. So the question for the live stream and the recording is, how can a non-professional, I believe is how you put it, or basically it's a small church that doesn't have college education or whatever. You don't need college education. But yeah, I believe that referral is really important. So if there are cases where there is severe complexity, people can be in over their heads. And it takes training to understand how to kind of untangle this ball. So there's a ball of yarn. Think of a ball of yarn. And my dad died. That's a tangle. My dad was also an alcoholic. That's a big tangle. My brother abused me when I was really little. That's another big tangle. And all of a sudden we have this massive ball of yarn that's been really tangled up. And that's really complex to unpack. And it can be really difficult for someone who hasn't had a lot of someone who hasn't had training in understanding how to kind of pick those pieces out in a healthy way that's layered within this safe relationship. And so I would recommend referral in those situations if there are complex situations like that. And then also, alongside of the referral, that's one part of the whole of the human being. So sometimes they'll need that financial support. Maybe it's paying for the counseling that the person needs, or maybe it's a residential treatment that they need, and the church provides that financial support. Or they provide structured activities alongside of the counseling with individuals who are safe within the community. So you don't have to have all the answers, because there are people that do have answers and they do have training outside of your small community. If that makes sense. All right, you all are dismissed. Have a good night.